Hey everyone, welcome to New York City Ruby Meetup. Today we have Dennis Martinez. He'll be talking about Kamal. Originally, I picked this topic out kind of like, hey, I'm starting a new Ruby project. You know, always like kind of these deployment tools. It's always great to start it off at the beginning and get things right, than rather than trying to bolt it on later. And I'm like, oh, Kamal sounds hot. Where can I find a resource? What can I do to get started on it? And I couldn't find any good resources. This is only like 2 months ago or something, and I'm like, this is crazy. And I kind of started Googling around and I actually ended up finding Dennis's article. And Dennis has had a pretty elaborate article. I'm like, oh wow, this is good. Hey, I need a speaker for New York City Ruby meetup. So let's do two birds with one stone. And so I reached out to Dennis and he was gracious enough to be like, sure, I'll give a talk. Can you give me some time? I'm like, okay. Yes, we'll give you September. You can get ready for that. But so really, I mean, I'm asking Dennis here to give a talk on Kamal because yeah, he wrote a lot. I'm like really impressed with his writing, and I think I think it's really good to kind of just it's not Ruby related particularly, but it's kind of like, hey, this is a tooling that we should all probably have in our tool belt, even as Rubyists. And I think it's Kamal's pretty cool that we don't need to be, it should be language independent, but I'm sure I'll learn more as through Dennis's talk. And yeah, I'm really excited to have Dennis talk to us on Kamal today. So without further ado, here's Dennis Martinez on Kamal.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that intro. And again, thank you for the invite to speak. I'm uh, very much appreciate the opportunity to be able to at least share a little bit of what I've learned when it comes with Kamal, and just try to share that knowledge a little bit, and hopefully give people a little bit of uh, of a introduction on how it works and to see if it's something that would interest people a little bit more to do. So hopefully I'll get that there. Um, so so the title of this talk, I just titled it The Next Big Thing in Web App Deployments, which I kind of feel that it might be. So just a little bit of introduction about myself. My name is Dennis Martinez. I'm a freelance software engineer, currently specializing in web development with Rails, automated testing, and some DevOps on the side as well. I'm originally from Puerto Rico, but I've lived in New York City and in San Francisco before arriving in Osaka, Japan, where I am right now, and where it's currently 7 o'clock in the morning on Thursday. I've been here for about 9 years now, and I've been working remotely with companies all over the globe. And I've worked with startups pretty much exclusively for the last 20 years now, mostly focusing on Ruby and Ruby on Rails applications since 2008. So I don't know how many of you were working on Rails apps during that time, but while building the actual app experience, building the actual app was, still a great experience as it is today. Deploying Rails apps back then to production was a completely different story. We didn't have as many choices for getting a server up and running in minutes like we do now with all the cloud services that we have. We used to have to do a lot of upfront configuration for the web servers, the database servers, and anything else we needed. And back then, although we were beginning to see development tools like Capistrano beginning to surface up, it was still pretty bumpy to get things working pretty well. Like there were complete books written only on the topic about deploying Rails applications. So that should give you an idea of how complex things were back in the day. And even if you did manage to get things working, you still needed to deal with, monitoring, scaling, debugging when things inevitably went wrong. So these days we have it a lot easier, especially with platforms like Heroku and Render, where you could get your entire infrastructure set up with just a few clicks and you could just deploy your application with a single command. So we don't have to worry about all the complexity that we used to have before. But the problem is that while these existing services are really, really great and they work excellent, they can get pretty expensive pretty quick if you're not careful. So Most web applications start off pretty simple, needing only like a single web server and a database, and this won't cost you a whole lot. This will just cost you a few dollars a month. Then you realize that you have to add another data source like Redis to handle caching, which adds a little bit more to that cost. After a while, you realize that that tiny starter web server that these services give you constantly runs out of memory. So you're going to start spinning up instances to get additional computing capacity, which will continue to add to these costs. Then, as your app grows, your application now needs full text search. So you have to add Elasticsearch, for example, which isn't cheap on any cloud service. So that's going to add a little bit of cost to your monthly spend. And on it goes, adding new services is needed. And over time, all of these services will really add up to some hefty monthly bills. And I'm pretty sure if you worked with any type of organization, you've probably seen how these bills can get pretty crazy pretty quickly. So this is where Kamal can help. So Kamal, for those who still need a little bit of an intro, it's a lightweight web application deployment tool built by David Heinemeier Hansen, or DHH, over at 37 Signals. As a quick high-level overview, Kamal is an infrastructure agnostic tool that uses Docker containers to package up and deploy your applications on any server of your choice. It also handles setting up other parts of your infrastructure like databases, so you don't have to worry about those parts either. So why should you use Kamal? So one of the main reasons that I prefer to use Kamal is its ease of use. So setting up and deploying a Kamal configured web app is just as easy as doing it with a platform like Heroku, for example, if not simpler. With just a single command, you could get a fully functional web app working on a brand new server in minutes, which I'll briefly show later. Another primary reason for using Kamal is that it gives you full control over the infrastructure where you want to deploy your app. As mentioned earlier, Kamal is infrastructure agnostic, so you could deploy your application on a cloud server from DigitalOcean or Hetzner Cloud, or on an on-premise server that you built. It doesn't matter where you deploy the app, but the important thing is that with Kamal, you know exactly which hardware you're using and who's using it, something that you won't get with a service like Heroku or Render. Being able to use whatever hardware you want also means that using Kamal is tends to be a lot cheaper for what you get. You could spin up a low-end cloud server that costs less than $10 a month that'll run your entire application infrastructure, which works great for low traffic apps, and it'll definitely be a lot more powerful than a basic dyno at Heroku. Another benefit of Kamal is that while it was originally built to work on Ruby on Rails applications, you can use Kamal for any web app as long as it's packaged in a Docker container. So for instance, I've used Kamal to deploy web apps built with Go without any issues. The consistency of using this same deployment mechanism across different frameworks can really help with productivity across different projects and different teams. And finally, Kamal uses a proxy service under the hood called Traefik. Traefik is a modern reverse proxy and a load balancer that works great for routing requests into your Docker containers. It has a lot of built-in functionality, like the ability to generate SSL certificates with Let's Encrypt, and it uses and to implement middleware as well that manipulate incoming traffic without needing to touch your code base, which I'll touch a little bit on later in this talk. So the reason I say it's using Traefik for now is because the team at 37 Signals is actually working on building a brand new proxy service for Kamal that'll likely replace Traefik in the future. But currently, as far as I can find, there's really no clear timeline for it yet. So hopefully what I cover today in this talk won't be instantly outdated by the time they release their proxy. So in this talk, I'll go through how you can quickly and easily get up and running with Kamal, along with a few things that you can do after you have your app deployed. So before diving in, there's a little bit of upfront work that you need to get your web apps prepared for Kamal. So first, you need to choose the infrastructure where you want to deploy your app. Like I mentioned a few times already, the beauty of Kamal is that it doesn't really care where you deploy your application, whether it's on the cloud or on a physical on-premise server. The only requirement is that any system that will use Kamal for deployments to your infrastructure needs to have SSH access, either via a public key or host-based authentication to those servers. So the reason for that is that Kamal performs all of its deployment commands on the host through SSH, and it'll need to do that without prompting for a password. So as long as you can access a server through SSH, any server will do for Kamal deployments. Next, you need to containerize your application using Docker. As part of the setup and deployment process, Kamal creates a Docker image of your application using a Docker file in your repo. So recent versions of Rails generate a Docker file for you, but if you have an older Rails app that wasn't generated using Rails 7.1, which is when they started including Docker files, you're going to have to create one from scratch for it. So kind of as a quick tip, if you do need to create a Docker file for an older Rails app, my suggestion is to create a separate new Rails app that has similar components as your existing app. So using the same type of database, the same type of JavaScript build system, etc. And use that generated Docker file that the new app has for your old one. So the Docker file that Rails generates, it's actually pretty well constructed. So it'll save you a lot of time by removing all the trial and error that typically happens when you have to create a Docker file from scratch. Besides using Docker, you'll also need read and write access to a container registry like Docker Hub or GitHub's container registry for this whole process to work. So the registry comes into play when you deploy your app with Kamal because it'll build your Docker image and push it to the registry, and then all the remote servers will pull the image from the registry onto the server so it can launch the application. So admittedly, this step is a bit of an annoyance when you're starting to use Kamal first, especially if you're used to deploying with other platforms. But maybe future versions of Kamal will change this requirement, but for now, we'll need to have at least access to a container registry. And finally, your application will need a health check endpoint. So the Traefik proxy server will ping a URL from your application, which is typically a GET request to the /up route on your app to ensure that the app is actually running. Again, newer Rails applications have a health check endpoint built in already, but for older Rails apps, you're going to have to add an endpoint for this. So this step is pretty quick since all you need to do is have a route that returns a 200 OK status code for Kamal to know that your app is working. So these are pretty much the prerequisites that you need for Kamal. So once you have this handled, then it's time to get Kamal installed and set up for your web app. So Kamal is available as a Ruby gem. So all you need to do is to run gem install Kamal on your system to get it installed. You could also run Kamal as a Docker container, and there's instructions in the Kamal documentation for that. Uh, if you don't want to install a gem on your system, but since this is a Ruby meetup, I'm sure most of us don't mind installing gems in our systems. And there might be some limitations with the Docker uh, with the Docker way of using Kamal as well, depending on your system. So I would recommend using the gem for this. Once Kamal is installed in your system, then you can initialize Kamal in your web application by running the Kamal init command in the root of your project. So this command generates a few files in your repo. First, it generates a .kamal/hooks directory, which with scripts that you can modify if you need to run commands at different points in the deployment process, like before building the Docker image or after deployment. I won't talk much about these Kamal hooks, so if you're curious, check out the Kamal documentation for more details. It also generates a .env file to set up sensitive data through environment variables, which shouldn't be checked into the code repo. Finally, it creates the config/deploy.yaml file, which is the main deployment configuration for Kamal. The .env file consists of key value pairs that we can use to configure our app, typically containing sensitive information like API keys, database passwords, and others that you don't want to expose as plain text. So if you've used something like the .envgem or work with another framework like Next.js, for example, this should look really familiar to you. So in Kamal, we can refer to the keys defined in this .m file to use them as values as part of the deployment and the configuration. So we can keep sensitive data out of the configuration files and out of the code repo as well. And the config/deploy.yaml file is where all the action happens. So here we'll define the hosts, the services, and the other configuration needed for deploying our web app. When initializing Kamal in a repo, the default config/deploy.yaml file contains a lot of sections showing everything that the tool is actually capable of. But for the purposes of this talk, I'll keep it simple and I'll only focus on the main parts for getting a Rails application deployed successfully, and I'll go through each of these sections in a little bit more detail. So first off, we'll have the service section, which is the name of the web app. And this name is actually used by Kamal to configure the container names under the hood. So we can name this service anything we want. And in this case, I'm calling this service nycrb-meetup. The next is the image name, which is the name to use when building the Docker image. So depending on the container registry that you'll use to push the built Docker image when you're doing your deploys with Kamal, you're going to need to make sure to follow the registry's naming conventions for this step here. So for this example, I'm going to use GitHub's container registry, which expects the name of a GitHub account or organization, which in this case is Denmark, and the image name that I want to use for the actual Docker image, which is nycrb-meetup. The following section is the server section, which is where we specify the host that we want to deploy our application to. So here you can use either an array of server IP addresses or host name that are accessible through SSH and that can access your Docker registry as well. You could either use just the IP addresses, or you can split them into different roles, like I'm doing here with a web role, just to configure them separately. So by default, Kamal will need a web role containing the servers that will host your web app. So this is pretty much where the main application is going to be deployed to. If we only specify an array of IP addresses instead of defining the actual host or role name, which is web in this case, Kamal will assume that all the servers are web servers or have the web roles. So I would suggest still explicitly setting the web role like I did in this example, even if you don't have any other roles to define for now, because it makes it more flexible to modify in the future. So if in the future I want to add a worker role for asynchronous jobs, then I just need to add the new role underneath this one, and I'll be able to configure everything separately without having to do a whole lot of changes. But for now, for this example, I only have the web role and I only have the host using a single server. The next section is the registry section. So here's where we're going to configure our container registry that Kamal will use to push images built in our system and pulled into each of the servers configured in the previous section that I just showed right now. So there's a few things to configure here in this section. And if the server isn't specified, which I do have here, a Kamal by default is going to use Docker Hub as its container registry. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to use GitHub's container registry. So for the server, for the server key here, I've set the URL for the container registry service, which is ghcr.io. We also need to set up authentication to the container registry. So we need to specify the username and the password, which it'll use to actually push the built image and save it to the registry. So if you notice, we've used a reference here to an environment variable, so we don't have to put this password or authentication token in plain text. So the value of this environment variable here called Kamal registry password, it's actually set in the .m file, so it's all kept away as a secret, and I don't have to put it in plain text in the configuration. So speaking of environment variables, the next section is env, which lets us set environment variables to inject into the containers of our web apps. So there's two ways that you could specify environment variables using Kamal. You could specify them as clear environment variables, which are just key value pairs for non-sensitive data that we can specify using plain text here, like setting the Rails environment or other configuration settings here. We also have a list of secret environment variables for sensitive data that we don't want to set in plain text, like the Rails master key or the database password, for example. The values for all of these environment variables are also specified in the .m file. So anything you add to this configuration here, you need to make sure that the .m file has a respective value for it so that Kamal can use it. The next part of this configuration is the builder section, which configures how to handle building the Docker image for our app. So generally, there's a ton of options to set here, but for this example, there's only one single setting that I set, which is called multi-arch, and that's set to false. And the reason why I did this is because Kamal, by default, builds multi-architecture Docker images anytime you do a deploy. So for instance, if you're developing on a newer MacBook that runs on Apple Silicon for development, that uses an ARM chip. So, but if you're deploying this application, if you're deploying the Docker image to a non-ARM Linux server, for example, then you're going to need to have basically a Docker image for both architectures, and Kamal handles that for you. However, the issue with that is that creating a Docker image for different platforms, it's typically tends to be very slow, especially the first build, because it does happen through emulation. So it'll take a while to actually do that. And in my example, since I'm using a Linux system for both development and deployment, I can safely bypass this setting. So it'll just create a single architecture image, which is a lot faster than the actual defaults. But there's a lot of different configuration settings that you might need to set here in this example. So I would encourage anyone interested in using Kamal to read the documentation a little bit more in details to know how Kamal actually handles all this stuff. And finally, the last section in this Kamal configuration is the accessories section. So in Kamal, an accessory is pretty much an additional service you can spin up alongside with your servers, like a database that interacts with with your application. The services pretty much use Docker images as well, and they're handled separately from deployments because you don't need to redeploy or restart database servers, for example, anytime you update your app. So Kamal will handle the initial boot up and setup for you. You could manage it. You can manage these accessories a little bit as well, but pretty much they're not going to be touched during regular deployments as well. So in this example, my application needs a Postgres database and a Redis server, which are defined here. And I'm also setting up some configuration for them, like mounting volumes to persist the data and setting up different environment variables to configure the usernames and passwords based on the actual Docker image. So if you've used Docker and Docker Compose before separately, this section works pretty much identical to setting up different services using those tools. So pretty much the everything I showed here shows how to deploy a typical Rails application using Kamal. So once we have all of this information in a config/deploy.yaml file set up in our repo, we can actually begin using Kamal to get our servers up and running. And to see this in action, we're going to do this in a quick, very brief live demo, because what could possibly go wrong whenever you're doing things live, right? So I actually have a Rails app that I built as a demo for this meetup that's all set up using Kamal with the same configuration I just showed right now. Um, I will probably share my screen here, switch things. Um, so I pretty much have this same configuration set up here, with the main difference being the server IP address. I spun up a new server on Hetzner Cloud just before this talk as well. So it'll be starting from a completely blank slate of having nothing set up. So we should be ready to go just with deploying the app. So going to a terminal screen right now. The first time we're deploying an application to a server using Kamal, we have to use the Kamal setup command. So this command does a few things to bootstrap our servers and get everything ready for the application to actually start working. And it does take a few minutes. So while this is running, I will actually attempt to share my screen again, going back to where I was. So uh, while that's happening in the background, I'll go through exactly what that Kamal setup process does. I can see, there we go. All right. So first, when you run Kamal setup, it'll log into your defined servers through SSH as the root user using public key or host-based authentication. And the root user is actually the default user unless it's specified in the configuration. So after logging in, it'll check Docker and it'll check if Docker and curl are actually installed on the server. And if they're not, it'll handle the installation if needed. So one thing to note here is that if you're not logging into the server as the root user, as the default root user, Kamal is not going to perform this stuff for you. So you're going to be responsible for making sure that they're installed. For simplicity in this demo, I'm using the root user on the server for deploying the app, but you might want to consider using a separate user for real production environments for security purposes. Next, we'll log into Kamal will log into the container registry, both on the local system and on the remote web servers. After that, it'll build the Docker image locally based on the repo's Docker file and push the image to the container registry. So once that's done, the remote web servers are going to pull in that newly built image. And then Kamal is going to set up all the environment variables from the .m file in your repo on the remote servers. Next, Kamal will set up the Traefik proxy service on the web servers and open up port 80 for them so that we can access them. Then it'll spin up all the specified accessories that your configuration defined. So that means that our database and Redis servers in the example app are going to be up and running as well. And then finally, Kamal is going to launch the application in a container and perform a health check on the application to ensure that it's up and running. So everything that I just explained here takes about 3 to 5 minutes, I guess. Uh, for the first time, usually it takes a little bit less than that. But if everything goes well, then your application will be up and running. So we'll get back here, and it does seem that uh, my deployment actually finished, and everything looks like it ran well. It took about 2.5 minutes, which is actually pretty fast. So I'm very happy that that actually went through, and I don't have to continue filling in this talk with something. Then if I go to, I already have a domain set up for this. So pretty much if I go to my server that I spun up here, thankfully it is working and everything is working pretty well. So our app is already up and running and deployed and working with Kamal. So with just a single command, once you have everything set up, everything just works pretty quick. And I'm very happy that somebody actually jumped in on this. So so yeah, so this is just pretty much how it works. So once you understand kind of like how Kamal works and how everything is kind of set up, you can get an application up and running in less than 5 minutes. Like um uh besides provisioning the server and getting this all set up, it'll probably it currently takes me less than 5 minutes to actually spin up an application these days on any cloud service. So let me.
Hey, everybody, hit it. So you DDoS him. Hurry up.
Well, it's a cloud server, so please be gentle. All right. So yeah, so now that we have our server set up and our app is running, we can actually use Kamal to begin to manage this. So I'll go through some of the most common commands you will likely use in your day-to-day work to manage your web apps. So the command you'll likely use the most is Kamal-deploy. And as the name implies, Kamal-deploy bundles up the latest code checked in the repo using Docker, pushes it to the container registry, and replaces the currently running containers on your servers. This command also makes sure that the Traefik proxy service is up. It verifies that the latest Docker image it pulled from the registry can start up, and it cleans up any old and stale containers and images from the servers as well. Kamal also has a Kamal redeploy command, which pretty much does the same thing. It updates the web app, but it does skip some things like the checking the Traefik proxy and cleaning up that Kamal deploy actually does. So while this does speed up deploys a little bit if you're making minor changes, it's generally recommended to actually use Kamal deploy most of the time just to make sure that things are all set up and cleaned properly. So um, this does exist, but maybe Kamal deploy is not that big of a difference. Another command that you'll likely rely on is the Kamal app exec command. So this one lets you execute commands on your remote servers. And by default, when you run Kamal app exec, it'll actually start a new Docker container of your application on the defined servers in the configuration, and it'll run the specified command inside of those containers. Also, something to keep in mind is that it'll execute the command by default on all the servers you defined. So if you have 5 different web servers and you run this command without any sort of flags, it'll actually run the same command 5 different times. So that is definitely something to keep in mind because I ran into this many times myself. So the Kamal app exec command also accepts some very useful flags to limit the scope of the execution, like the primary flag, which executes the command only on the first server in your list, and the host flag, if you want to run the command on one or more specific servers. So this kind of limits the scope instead of running it on all servers, as I just mentioned right now. Another helpful flag is the reuse flag, which executes the command inside of the currently running container for your app instead of spinning up a new one, which is pretty great for debugging issues in the active container, which you'll probably need from time to time. And finally, the interactive flag allows you to run interactive commands, which you'll need if you want to run the Rails console or similar commands on the actual server. The next command is one that you probably won't use that often, but it is essential for updating your apps, which is Kamal env push. As mentioned, when running the initial Kamal setup command for bootstrapping the server, one of the steps that Kamal does is to set up the environment variables on the servers based on the .m file and passes those values along to the containers when they boot. However, if you do update your .m file after that initial setup, whether it's to add a new environment variable or update an existing one, you're going to need to push those updates to the server, which is where Kamal and push comes into play. This is really important to remember because the Kamal deploy or redeploy commands, they currently don't do this for you automatically. So it's really easy to update your app and uh, uh, forget to push any new environment variables, which can cause your app to not work as expected. So anytime you update your .m file, you're going to need to run this command. Speaking of your app not working as expected, Kamal also has some commands to help you revert to a working version of your app if you accidentally push some bad code. So the Kamal app containers command actually shows you a list of all the containers on your server, both currently running ones, along with any stopped containers. So when you deploy any new updates on your app using Kamal-deploy, Kamal will stop the current running container and it does keep it on the server. It'll pretty much keep all of your old containers for at least the past 3 days. So the deploy command also runs a command to clear any older containers that are over 3 years old, just to keep things clean. But that does mean that you will still have all the Docker images or Docker containers that Kamal has built up and push to the for at least the last 3 days. So using the Kamal app containers command lets you find the image tag for one of those older containers that you did that you know was working in the past. And then you can use the Kamal rollback command to actually quickly revert back to that existing image tag. So you can just spin up an older version while you fix any issues that you have on your side. So these two commands will help you roll back to a well-known version of your application in case you have some troubles. So Kamal has a ton of other commands, and this is just barely scratching the surface. But it does have a lot of other commands to manage your application and the servers running them. So I encourage people to check out the command section in the Kamal documentation for a lot more details on this. You could also run the Kamal help command in your local system to show all this information and some other commands that probably still aren't fully documented on Kamal's website, since the last time I checked, there were still a few gaps that weren't really filled. So uh, I highly recommend taking the time to explore these different commands and discover what else you can do once you have your application up and running with Kamal and you're managing everything through it. So now that we've seen how straightforward it is to get a web app working with Kamal and a few ways to manage it, let's touch upon a few things that go beyond the basics. So I won't go deep into these since I don't have a lot of time to discuss them, but at the end of the talk, I'll leave a link to my website and my YouTube channel, which does a deeper dive into all of these topics in case you're interested in learning a little bit more. Now, Kamal is a deployment tool first and foremost, but you can also use it to help you make backups of your application's database. These days, most Rails applications use PostgreSQL as its primary database in production. And while you can create scripts on your servers to back up your Postgres database and have that all done on the server yourself, there is a quick and easy way to do this using Kamal. So there's a Docker image called Postgres Backup S3 created by Elliot Sugarman, which allows you to run a container that can make backups of the data in a PostgreSQL database server and send it to an Amazon S3 bucket or any S3 compatible storage provider. We can add this image as a Kamal accessory with a few environment variables for configuration, like AWS credentials and the schedule you want to run for the backups, as shown in this example here. So after you set up a similar section like this in Kamal's deploy.yaml file, we can just update the server environment variables with Kamal and push, as I mentioned earlier, and you just boot up this accessory. So once you have this up and running, this service actually will begin taking snapshots of your database and storing them on the cloud as configured with no other intervention from you. You can also restore your database from an existing backup by running some commands on this accessory container in case of emergency as well. So if you're using or plan to use Kamal for a web app that uses PostgreSQL as the database server, I highly recommend using this setup to keep your data safe because it works really, really well. And it's very, very simple to use. So I breezed through this super quickly because I don't have time. But I do have a YouTube video covering this topic called Hassle-Free Automated Postgres Backups for Kamal Apps, which you can find on my website. And I'll also share a link of this on the NYC Ruby Discord server as well, just to have that as well. Or feel free to reach out to me if you want to know more information. So another thing to point out is that by default, Kamal sets up the Traefik proxy service only with port 80 open, which is for non-secure HTTP connections. So going back to the demo app, you may notice that when you open the site after the initial deployment, the site is running on just regular HTTP instead of secure HTTPS. So Kamal assumes that you will have like a load balancer with SSL termination, or you're managing connections using something like Cloudflare to provide SSL encryption when a user makes a request to your domain. And while these options are okay, they really don't provide that full end-to-end encryption. They only provide secure connectivity up to the DNS service or the load balancer, and then it passes along the request to your origin server and the application unencrypted. And this might be fine for most apps, but you may want a full end-to-end encrypted connection between the user and your application. And for that, you're going to need an SSL certificate for your server. So these days, setting up an SSL certificate is easily accomplished thanks to Let's Encrypt. So you can generate a certificate for your domain for free and have the process entirely automated, including renewals. Kamal doesn't have a direct setting for generating SSL certificates, but that doesn't mean that you can't use Let's Encrypt if deploying with Kamal. So the Traefik proxy service that Kamal already has built in does have support to automatically generate Let's Encrypt certificates and handle everything from setting up your applications to renewing certificates before they expire. And this is done through a combination of updating the Traefik configuration and setting Docker container labels, which Traefik uses to configure how it routes traffic to your app. And the Kamal configuration does let us modify how Traefik works, and it'll let us add labels to our application containers. So we can set this whole system up entirely through the deploy.yaml file for Kamal that we use to deploy the application. There is a little bit of initial setup needed on the server, but once you have that set up and you have all this configuration set up here, you'll have a complete secure connection from the user to your application without needing to use a load balancer or Cloudflare or any other service like that. So again, I went through this very, very quickly, but for a complete guide on how to use this, I also have another YouTube video on the topic called Secure Your Kamal App Deployments with Let's Encrypt. So I'll also share a link of this on the Discord server, and feel free to reach out if you want to know more information. Speaking of Traefik container labels, they're actually a very powerful tool worth learning once you start using Kamal. And one of the cool things that you can do with these labels is that they can add more functionality to your app through the Traefik proxy service using its built-in middleware. So in Traefik, middleware acts as the bridge between requests to your server and your application running inside a Docker container. So it'll intercept any incoming requests coming into the proxy service, and it modifies how to handle that request, like changing the headers before passing the request or redirecting the request to another host, which can be useful if you need to handle something before the request actually hits your application. Uh, Also, middleware can set up additional functionality like basic authentication, compression, rate limiting, and a lot more without having to add any new code to your app, which is a pretty nice bonus to have. So when using Kamal, you can set up these pieces of middleware simply by adding a few labels to your web application container as configured in the deploy.yaml configuration file. So with just a few additional lines of configuration, you can chain together different ways to manipulate incoming requests for your needs. So in this quick example that I show here, I'm actually setting up two pieces of middleware, one for compression. So it'll actually set up gzip compression uh, to 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 make the connection a little bit faster. And it also sets up some rate limiting as well. So I don't have to do that on the application side either. And Traefik will handle this for us, and we can use this directly with Kamal as well. Again, this is very, very quick, just a very brief introduction, just to uh, just let people know that the middleware does exist and we can use it. But if you want to see some live examples on how to set up Traefik middleware and see some of them in action, I have yet another YouTube video on the topic titled "Supercharge Your Kamal-deployed app with Traefik middleware." And again, I'll share this link and feel free to reach out if you want more information. Now, for the past 45 minutes or so, you've heard me talk about how awesome Kamal is, how it can save you money, how it could deploy your web apps and have everything working smoothly once everything is up and running. But unfortunately, Kamal is far from perfect, and it does have a few stumbling blocks and gotchas that might trip you up at the start. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of those pitfalls of using Kamal instead of using an existing platform like Heroku, so you and your team can weigh the pros and cons of it. So the main pitfall when using Kamal is that you're fully responsible for maintaining your servers. So that means you need to provision servers, you need to keep your servers patched, you need to ensure that your infrastructure can scale up as needed, run database backups, and a lot of other DevOps work that you don't have to do when you're using another platform as a service. So for startups and small companies that might not have the in-house expertise to handle this, nor the money to hire someone who can, managing infrastructure is an additional burden when you're likely already super slammed with work. So using something like Kamal will probably add a little bit more to your plate. Another issue around Kamal is that the error messages that it does print out aren't the most user-friendly. So when things go wrong, it's not always clear where the issue is or even how to fix it, especially for developers who are new to using the tool and don't really have a clear idea on how everything works under the hood. Giving the different moving parts that compose of a Kamal deployment, like using Docker and the Traefik proxy service, it could lead to a lot of time wasted on debugging deployments instead of actually working on your app, because it's very difficult to nail down exactly where things might go wrong. Documentation is another area where Kamal can use some improvement. And while documentation is slowly getting better with each new version of Kamal, there's still plenty of places that don't have a lot of clear information, in my opinion, at least. So yeah, like for example, most of the documentation for commands just have like the very bare minimum of information, leaving you to have to figure out how specific commands or flags work on your own. So the screenshot that I have here is actually a pretty good example because the Kamal app command is pretty powerful to manage your application, and it does have a lot of different sub commands as well. But there's really no detail about each of these sub commands as well. So you kind of have to either find it elsewhere in the documentation, or you just need to try things on your own. Um, and things usually aren't up to date as well. So when I took the screenshot up in the corner, it actually says Kamala's version 181, but it was actually 183 by the time I took this. So documentation usually isn't on par with the actual changes that do happen. Another thing that I noticed is that outside of the intro video that's on the homepage that DHH made explaining how Kamal works, there really isn't much in the way of like comprehensive how-to guides or troubleshooting tips to deal with problems. So when you're using Kamal, you're going to spend a lot of time digging through blogs and YouTube videos like mine to learn how to do things beyond the basics. So for a lot of things, expect to be on your own, which could be fun if you're a crazy person like myself who likes tinkering with these things. But for most teams that need to move fast and get things done, this might really slow you down. So with that, it's just worth reminding everyone that Kamal is not a perfect solution. And while it'll help many with their deployment woes and help save a lot of money compared to using a platform as a service, these issues might make things turn out to actually be more expensive and challenging to implement. So as with using any new framework, library, tool, etc., make sure to evaluate your options before going all in on a solution. So, despite all these issues and the slight initial learning curve, my opinion is that Kamal is actually an excellent choice for deploying web applications, especially for companies that are looking to move away from their existing platforms or those who haven't nailed down their deployment processes yet. So, as a freelancer, I've seen just about every type of deployment method used throughout the years for web applications, from simple ones like using a platform like Heroku to using tools like Capistrano to cobbled up and bandaged together bash scripts that no one dares to even look at for fear of breaking them. And even some teams who actually do manual code pulls and service restarts. And I feel that Kamal does a much better job at than most of these tools, thanks to using a simple and somewhat opinionated configuration, which is a 37 signal specialty if you use any of their tools before. Um, Once you have a grasp of how Kamal is working, of how Kamal actually works, then you can get things up and running pretty quickly and smoothly. So I hope that the little bit that I showed here in this talk gives you a better idea of how Kamal works with a real Rails app, from getting things up and running to managing your app after it's deployed. And plus the few extras that I went through pretty quickly, like setting up SSL and configuring database backups. This all, again, it barely scratches the surface. And there's a ton more that you could do with Kamal that I didn't have time to discuss here. But even if you don't have an existing need to migrate your web apps away from where they're currently running, I still really encourage developers to at least take a look at the tool, since it can provide immense benefits by giving full control of where you place your systems. And remember that great developers focus on building, not deploying. So let Kamal handle the heavy lifting for you so you can go ahead and you can do what you do best. And if you're looking for someone to assist with getting Kamal up and running for you or fixing issues with existing Kamal deployments, feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to help. And that brings me to the end of the talk. Thank you so much for sticking around, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Are you answering questions or are you just done? No questions?
I have questions if Dennis has time, but if Dennis is happy and he did his talk and his deploy to production was successful, doesn't want to answer questions, that's perfectly allowable.
No, that's fine. Let's mess things up.
Cool. So yeah, thanks for giving your talk, Dennis. That was really cool. I have a few questions, and when you've had enough of me, we can move on to the next person. I was curious about this up endpoint when it doesn't return 200 OK and give you the nice green background screen. Is there an option to do a rollback or to not deploy?
Yeah, so if the health check does fail, it doesn't proceed with the deploy. And one of the issues is that it'll give you one of those. esoteric error messages that I briefly touched upon. So it's not very clear what's actually happening, but it just doesn't complete the deploy. So there's a possibility that it will actually leave your application in a weird kind of state, which has happened to me in the past. But in general, it just won't proceed with that actual deploy. So I do believe that if you have, if your app is actually already running, and the health check does fail, I do think it'll keep the other container up and running. But I'm not 100% sure on that right now, now that I mention it. But yeah, but this is one of the quirks that um where Kamal could still probably use a little bit of help when you're doing these types of deploys, because it can leave your system in a weird, inconsistent state.
Cool. That's terrifying, but it's a new problem to have. I think with render, with fly, with Heroku, you always get you're trading off one problem for another. So it's cool that there's a different set of problems. My next question is, how does Kamal work in a team environment? So, you have the principle of least access. So you don't necessarily want everybody to have access to everything. And when people do access things, you want to know who's accessing it and what do they do, what they're doing. With Kamal, do you just set up separate like accounts for everybody with their own username and password so you can keep track of things, or what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, like everything you do with Kamal needs SSH access to it. So I think that's pretty much the main point of, I guess, security that you could have there. So um pretty much I've used Kamal in a very small team setting, and pretty much I was the only person responsible for deploys. So I don't think I'm very well qualified to answer this, because nobody else really had any access, because nobody else really actually knew how to do uh how to deal with the deployment and the server. But I think uh that I think that one is, again, going back to the whole DevOps thing. So pretty much you're going to have to manage this, all this access on your own. So pretty much if you do have a team environment, you'll probably need to give access to those servers to whoever's going to be responsible, and just use like the built-in server tools to actually do things like traceability and things of that nature. So this is one of the things where you're again, welcome, you're in DevOps now, so you're gonna have to do that pretty much on your own as well.
Awesome. That's good to know. Thanks. The last question I have before I stop bothering you is, you touched on the middleware that was available
Mm.
through Traefik, and I'm curious if there are ways, I don't know necessarily with that, but in general to do observability with Kamal. Like if I want to have a sync for standard out and standard error on all the Docker containers I'm deploying, if I want to see CPU utilization and memory utilization, is there an easy way to do that, or am I back in DevOps land rolling my own?
Pretty sure you're back in DevOps land. So this is a topic that I'm actually exploring for YouTube video that I do want to create. So, yeah, from what I've seen, pretty much you have to roll your own like observability platform and set things up like that on your own. So again, this is more of a DevOps thing. Thankfully, with tools like using using tools like Terraform and Ansible and these other tools that will actually help you set all this infrastructure as code, it does become a little bit easier, but you do need somebody who can handle that for you. Like you're not going to have things built in like, Heroku has already, where you could see everything there. So again, going back to DevOps, you have to do the things yourself pretty much.
I was hoping for a module like Prometheus and Grafana, one click
Yeah,
gem, but that's all right. Cool. Thank you for answering my questions. I appreciate it.
yeah, no problem.
Did you mute yourself, Andrew?
No, no, just waiting for Dennis. It was just, yeah, no, thanks a lot. That was very useful. The I remember one of the original promises of Kamal is that you can deploy to your own, like deploy to the cloud or to your own hardware or even your local. Maybe how is that possible? Like I just want to deploy my app to my Raspberry Pi that I'm
Yeah,
running locally.
I do have like a little home lab going on here, and I do have some small spare servers that I use for tinkering around with stuff, and I've been using Kamal quite a bit to actually deploy apps to these local servers. So it's just again, as long as you have access to the server through SSH, you can use pretty much anything. So I haven't used a Raspberry Pi. But it it should work pretty well. So
I see. So it just means like just making sure like the Raspberry Pi has SSH access and that has you can do like, apt-get or whatever to
yep.
install the install curl and Docker and whatever else it needs
Yeah,
and Camel.
yeah, I mean, as long as as long as you can install Docker and curl, which are pretty much what Kamal sets up for you, it you should be good to go with that.
And you just have to point, I think just in the Camel config, you just point it to be,
Yep,
Raspberry Pi. And then
yep,
when I scale up, I can go to like just put in render and it'll
yep,
do. Oh,
yeah,
yeah,
pretty much.
that's like that's my dream, just to
Yeah.
be able to be like, Raspberry Pi to render to whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, of course you're gonna have to be responsible for migrating your data, but besides that, you know, as I showed in the very quick demo, just like running Kamal setup on wherever you need to do it, it just takes a few minutes once you have everything set up and running. So, um, you could just pretty much just point it to another server, a different environment, and you should be good to go.
Cool.
Yeah.
Here's another question. Are you talking about like one thing I always wonder is like because Kamal's kind of doing the version that when you do the deploy and it does like all the magic, how do you know which version is deployed? Like what is the way of tracking that? Like how do you know
But
that?
well, it does Kamal when it builds the Docker image, it does generate an image tag for it. I'm trying to remember if the image tag is
Is it just based
associated
on
to yeah to like the Git hash
SHA?
to the SHA hash. I'm not entirely sure, but it does have at least it does have uh uh it does let you know which kind of like image tag it actually builds upon. So I think that's pretty much the only way you could actually track that for now.
Right. And I guess in like microservice world, you start having like different versions of stuff and
Yeah.
you probably need to have your own versioning like dashboard basically say, hey, the main app is this version and like every
Yeah.
subset is that version and
Yep.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Kamal probably now that you mentioned that, I mean, it could probably work for microservices, but my guess is that the main intention is for monolithic applications, especially uh, as 37 signals. Uh, that's what they advocate. So I'm pretty sure that's kind of what it's more geared towards. I think once you start getting into microservices and things like that, maybe other deployment mechanisms will probably suit a little bit better than that, especially as they grow pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I guess since you mentioned about I know Andrew was talking about observability, and I guess I know that you said you had a video coming up for that, but I guess just to maybe throw something out there, what's been your experience like? Can you talk maybe a little bit about, having to implement something like that? Like, for example, at work, I actually using Datadog. So, I was just doing a monitor. I'm actually keeping an eye on something pretty important right now that I'm hopeful will not crash everything so that we can do our Ruby upgrades. So believe it or not, but I'm just kind of wondering, like, from your experience, what is it like that with, because Kamal is great. I can see the value in being a smaller place. I mean, you obviously kind of have to roll up your sleeves and do a lot of the work. And I think that's by design, right? Like that's kind of the intention, is to do a lot of that, because you're getting a lot of value, but a lot of cost savings as well too. Like, what has been your experience, doing that? Is it really kind of just rolling all your own? Is there some stuff that you have implemented for a client? I'm sure that can probably be a whole thing on its own, but I'm just kind of curious what that looks like. Maybe if you can give a little bit of detail on that in a Kamal world.
Yeah, I haven't had a whole lot of experience with it, especially with Kamal. Most of the apps, we just use a APM, like you said, like a Datadog or Scout, or even using something like a Sentry's performance tracking or things of that nature. So a lot of integrated stuff. I haven't done a whole lot of like Prometheus or Grafana and other kind of like separate tools. I do think those probably tend to will probably work better than to have like something like Datadog and things like that, just because um the intent behind Kamal is to be able to use your own hardware, probably use different types of hardware and things like that, and using a separate observability platform would probably yield a lot more benefits to that. I haven't had a lot of experience into that, which is why I wanted to dig into it a little bit more, because I think a lot of people have that the same question that you have, and I do as well. I just haven't had much of an opportunity to deal with that when it comes to mixing it with Kamal as well.
Okay, cool. Well, I mean, at least it's good to know is that even something like that's a kind of still off the shelf, you can still use. Like, it's not necessarily uncommon,
Yeah.
but just probably very costly knowing
Yes,
Datadog. But
exactly.
okay, cool, great. I mean, I guess since we were talking about the positive and negatives, I guess do you have, like, I don't know, any horror stories for this, like from working with a small client? Is there, I mean, I kind of wonder, because this is exciting just to kind of, again, like if you are doing something yourself, but at the same time, it's like you're right? You have to do DevOps, like you have to be responsible for these things. So you really have to have that mindset, and that, roll your sleeves up and want to do it, because sometimes, it just seems like it could be someone else's problem, right?
Yeah.
But in this
Yeah.
case, it's not. So, like, what has been like that? And I guess for some of, or at least for me, I work at a much larger company, well, even bigger now. So for us, everything is Kubernetes, GCP, all of that stuff. You have specialized teams. So what has been like that experience for you? I guess positive and negative, like working with, some small client. Have there been really big challenges? Have they been kind of like, oh, wait a minute, this is not really what we kind of wanted? Or just in general, just to see if maybe you have something you could throw out there. I'm just kind of curious, because I don't have as much experience, or I probably won't ever use something like this myself.
Mhm.
So I'm just kind of really curious to hear like what your experiences have been like, or anything, maybe a specific story, something you could share.
Yeah, I mean, I work pretty much with very small startups. So probably like the biggest company I've probably worked with is 50 people. So that just kind of gives you like the scale of what I typically work with. And usually in like small startups, there's a lot less pressure, a lot less things to deal with like that. I don't have any big horror stories like that. Though, I mean, there's been plenty of cases uh where we've deployed with Kamal and it works perfectly for a day or two, and then it just craps itself and stops working. And then pretty much just restarting it resolves the issue, and we never found any kind of resolution towards that. Again, going back to the unclear error messages that could happen. It just like for some reason, the application just decided to die in Docker and not want to spin up, and it's very difficult to actually get debugging into that. And I think uh, most clients actually don't mind throwing money at the issue. So either usually when that happens, when using Kamal and something doesn't work quite as expected, the solution is either to use a bigger server or to just go back to Heroku or whatever it is. And that's usually what happens with companies who are actually using Heroku or one of these similar services, is that they kind of see the promise of Kamal and they want to start controlling things on their end as well. But as soon as like the first tiny mishap happens, they immediately want to run back to something like Heroku. So I really hope that like the situation with debugging and things of that nature does improve, because I think that's been probably like the main hang up with me, that I really haven't been able to figure out how something why something is not working as it is. And of course, as a freelancer, like you're the person who are supposed to come up with the answers to these questions. And if I don't have the answers myself, then it's really, really frustrating to get into that. But there haven't been any horror stories as far as like, losing data or losing anything like that. It's just mostly like when Kamal works, it works beautifully. When it doesn't work, it could lead you to, just rip your hair apart. So that's pretty much it. Yeah. I think I've had the benefit of working with a lot of very, very small and very loose companies that haven't had that super strict uh, super strict requirements that many larger companies actually need to have. So I think I've had a lot of leeway when it comes to that.
I was gonna say, I'm surprised the companies, they want to throw money at the problem. It was like, hey, when there's a problem, why don't they just throw money at you, right? Like, hey, yeah,
Well,
oh yeah.
well, the problem is I'm usually more expensive than what they're actually throwing money at. So
I don't know. I don't think Heroku's that cheap anymore, is it?
hmm, it could add up pretty quickly.
It
I don't know if it ever
depends.
was cheap. I mean, I think that was always the big. It was convenient, right? It was easy.
Mhm.
I don't know if it was never ever necessarily cheap or affordable.
It's always borderline being cheap enough, but until you hit a certain inflection
Yeah.
point, a certain scale, and then you begin to suffer, and you start attending talks like this, wondering what it would be like if you moved off of Heroku.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Move this. Yeah.
Cool. Any more questions before we wrap up? Awesome. Well, awesome. I'm sure, Dennis, you gave us, your contact information. You're also on the Discord channel as well. And we will have this video up. But yeah, once again, thank you very much for taking time and doing this and getting up really early in the morning, like, getting up and doing a talk, right? That's a big challenge. And so thank you very much again. And yeah, if everyone can just give a quick round of applause. And
Yeah. Thank you again.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to coming in and talk and interacting with other people as well. It's always a fun thing to do, especially when I'm this far away.